Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, and welcome to the International Microhistory Online Seminar. Today, we welcome for the last talk of this series, and we're welcoming Chris Meissner and his co-author Alexander Klein, who are going to give a very topical presentation on tariffs and the US, entitled Tariffs Make US Manufacturing Great, using evidence from the Gilded Age. Before we start, let me just quickly remind you of the rules of engagement. You're very welcome to raise questions, both of substance and of clarification. However, we will not interrupt Chris for the first 40 minutes or up to 40 minutes, except for clarification questions. To raise your questions, please type them in the Q&A space available at the bottom of your screens. And after that, we'll have 20 minutes open for question and answering. So with no further ado, Chris, I think you can take the stage. We can see your slides. And now we can see you. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thanks for the introduction, Ray, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. This is joint work with Alex Klein, who should be on the line here, and we're happy to talk about this paper on tariffs and manufacturing in the late 19th century United States. So without further ado, let's remind ourselves that the United States was a pretty high tariff place in the late 19th century. Tariffs averaged about 30 or 40%. Here's a zoom in on the period we're looking at. In the manufacturing sector, which is what we'll be looking at today, tariffs averaged about 35, 40% over time. There's considerable inter-industry variation, as we'll see, but mainly it's a high tariff place. There are new tariff laws about once every 10 years or even more frequently during the period. Those are going to be in the background today, and we can talk about it, but a lot of tariff action in this period that is of interest. As we'll see, the United States was a growing economy after the Civil War, becoming an industrial nation. And we want to kind of try to assess the association between tariffs and industrial or manufacturing outcomes in this period. We're going to be focused on labor productivity to some extent, but we have other outcomes such as total output, employment, and number of establishments and things like that. And we're going to take an approach which is very disaggregated at the industry level. And we're also going to attempt, we'll see if we're successful, a blockades is a interesting paper that makes an attempt to assess the impact of trade policy in the 19th century. But other than that, what we really have is a series of either case studies or cross-country evidence. Of course, there's a large literature in the 20th century that relates liberalizations in quotes to economic and industrial outcomes. And so we're kind of going to be following in the footsteps of many of these authors. I'll get more into the previous research in a moment. But to do this causal inference sort of approach, we're going to present a new instrumental variable building off of the work of Andrew Greenland and John Lopresti, who have an interesting paper, which you haven't seen. You should check it out. And it's going to be in the spirit of a shift share instrument. And to kind of build intuition before we start it, we're going to be playing off the fact that a lot of tariffs in the 19th century were specific tariffs. For example, a specific tariff is written in the law as currency units per physical unit, so dollars per bottle of wine. And when that happens, price movements affect the ad valorem equivalent of a tariff. So hang on for more on that. I'll get into the details momentarily, but that's kind of the intuition. To pull this off, we needed to collect new tariff data and put together the manufacturing data. And this is going to be manufacturing data for the Census of Manufacturers at the 3-digit, highly disaggregated level. This is from the Census of Manufacturers. As I said, it's going to be at the state level. And we've got very detailed tariff information from the United States at the tariff line level, which will aggregate up to the industry level. And we've got all sorts of tariffs, which I'll show you in a moment, that we needed to clean and get organized and set up to use in this study. But it's a nice, interesting new data set, in my opinion. Our bottom line finding today is going to be that there's just no evidence of a positive relationship between tariffs and labor productivity in this period. Contrary to what some people have said recently, there's just no evidence of a positive relationship. We look at different outcomes, as I mentioned. Tariffs do seem to have some effect on the extensive margins, but that said, there's just lots of heterogeneity in the data, and I think it's interesting heterogeneity, and we'll be talking about that as we go along. If you want to see our bottom line finding in graphic form, it's kind of right here. This is the relationship between the log of the level of labor productivity for a number of state industry pairs in the period 1880 to 1910 or 1909. And that's kind of plotted against the level of tariffs in these industries and states. And what we find is a pretty significant negative relationship. So keep this picture in the back of your mind as we move along. It's kind of our bottom line finding, but to get there, we're going to go through some of the history. We're going to talk about the data, talk about our approach. I'll show you some tables and results, explore the heterogeneity, and if we have time, I'll try to tell you a couple of what I think are interesting stories about some particular industries, and then we'll conclude. So there's a lot of work on tariffs and economic outcomes in the 19th century. Doug Irwin has contributed many papers, and surprisingly, there's still a few things left to do. The reason is because for as much as Doug has done, to my knowledge, he hasn't collected every single tariff that the United States had in this period, which we are going to try to do. So we're going to make an advance on that front. And we're going to be primarily in agreement with Doug's bottom line, as I'll show you in a moment, but there's just a lot of work there. Yoon had an interesting paper, which was a computable general equilibrium paper that appeared at Explorations and showed that for the US, on the whole, tariffs made very little difference to productivity, to its manufacturing success in the period. And tariffs kind of were negligible as a force for industrialization in this period. And that's going to be consistent with our work, but obviously we're going to be doing a more empirical approach using a single equation, kind of IV approach, not a computable general equilibrium model. We have some other case studies. As I said, we're building off some of the work by Andrew Greenland and John Lopresti, who started circulating a paper in 2022 showing this new way to think about tariffs and exogeneity, which I'll talk about in a moment. On the other hand, what do we know about tariffs and economic outcomes in the 19th century? Well, not a whole lot, but Kevin O'Rourke and Sibylle Lehmann contributed a nice paper on cross-country outcomes, and they showed that manufacturing tariffs raised aggregate productivity growth in their study in 2011. Here we're going to be looking at one country in a disaggregated way and trying to assess the causal impact, whereas that paper was probably more in the vein of assessing the correlations. There's a nice new paper in JEH by Ostermeyer on tariffs and firms in Sweden in the 19th century. It's a great paper. If you have a chance to read it, I think the results are somewhat consistent with our work, in fact. And then we're going to be building on some of these ideas of specific tariffs, which have already been highlighted, but which nobody seems to have really used. Some people might ask, well, why would tariffs matter for the U.S. economy? Well, lots of reasons we can think of. Building up capacity in a competitive international environment, the infant industry argument. The period is one where lobbying and rent seeking are not uncommon and have been highlighted as forces driving tariffs in this period. We think that tariffs limit competition. That's pretty standard. A result from international trade, and I think that the level of competition matters in some way. So, in essence, we're going to be addressing this issue from an indirect vantage point. And after all, the period it's pretty well known for high levels of concentration, the trusts and the amalgamations and the monopoly power of many firms was a big issue at the time. And contemporaries related tariffs and the trade policy to competition or the lack thereof. Doug Irwin, in his assessment of U.S. tariffs, always makes sure to note that import tariffs are also an export tax. So anything you think imports are doing for the economy in a negative way, they're in terms of limiting competition, they're also holding back exports simply because tariffs raise prices, wages, and make the economy less competitive on the international scene. This is a result known as learner symmetry. There's some other issues like the sectoral and regional distribution of activity and welfare, and we're going to have a little bit less to say about those today, but they're in play as well. So tariffs are important in this period for assessing the growth of the American economy. There's no shortage of theorizing or motivation for thinking about these policies. Okay, so then I'll talk a little tiny bit about the historical background in this case, set up the IV, talk about the model and the data, and then show you some results. As well known, the U.S. became an emerging net exporter of manufactured products near the late 19th century, around about 1900. It emerges as a net exporter of manufactured products for the first time. Previously, the United States had been mainly a commodity exporter, cotton and wheat being principal exports. But by the, say 1900, this has changed a lot. So it's a period, again, of high tariffs, as we've seen, and the United States is emerging as a manufacturing powerhouse. From what we could tell based on a look at the original trade data, the official trade data, the U.S. is diversifying its trade partners and its product space. And so it's growing in a lot of ways, like trade economists might expect. And again, this is all done under a very restrictive trade policy with relatively high tariffs. Certainly compared to Great Britain or Denmark or Belgium, tariffs are very high. Perhaps in comparison to a place like Canada, where tariffs were also on the rise, or Argentina, tariffs weren't all that high in relative terms, but compared to European, or some European countries, tariffs were relatively high. The U.S. wasn't a big player in the trade treaty and the trade treaties that were signed in Europe in the 1860s and 70s. There were some attempts towards reciprocity at the end of our period, but rather limited. Tariffs are high kind of across the board, but again, there is interesting heterogeneity. Woolen industry had a tariff of over 80% on its final goods, whereas industry like paper might have a tariff of about 20%. There's a huge sectional or regional and party component to tariff policy. The Republicans primarily focusing on high tariffs, and the Democrats, the party of mainly the South, always desirous of lower tariffs. William McKinley, before he was president, was in Congress. The tariff of 1890, the tariff law of 1890, was called the McKinley Tariff. That was passed in the wake of a huge debate between Republicans and Democrats about the level of tariffs in the period. The tariff was passed. And pretty shortly thereafter, McKinley lost his seat in Congress. Apparently, there was a backlash to the higher tariffs of the McKinley tariff of 1890. So again, here you see Grover Cleveland reaching down for the tariff reform coin. He takes office in 1892, and the Democrats regain control of Congress and also the administration, and work to lower tariffs dramatically in the mid 1890s. But once they go out of office and power, Republicans again succeed in raising and it's something to fight against, and the consumers in the South are not benefiting from these high tariffs. So you see the donkey kicking away the full dinner pail here. So the bottom line here is, if you thought the U.S. success was because of tariffs in this period, think again. Doug Irwin's book and his large amount of work that he's done in recent decades suggests that it's difficult to make the case that tariffs were an important driving factor in late 19th century U.S. economic growth. And I think that's based off of his work and careful analysis of various industries and an overall very sensible look at the aggregate outcomes. Okay, so I have about 20 minutes to walk you through our empirical strategy, our data, and our results. So we're going to do that now. We have a pretty basic estimating equation here. We're going to estimate an equation that takes the log of some manufacturing outcomes. In this case, it's output per worker. And we're going to relate that variable on the left-hand side to tariffs. So AVE is the ad valorem equivalent of tariffs. And I'll take the log of 1 plus the average tariff rate as the independent variable that we're interested in. And beta 1 is the coefficient of interest. So after that, and explaining the subscripts, we've got industry K, state S, and census period T. So our data are at the industry, state, census period level. We'll include fixed effects for state industry pairs and census periods, and we have an error term there. So in addition to productivity, we'll be looking, as I said, at things like employment outcomes, total output, number of establishments, average establishment size, and so forth. All right, I have a joke this morning. I'm going to put on my trade economist hat. This is one I got at a seminar out in North Carolina recently. I was invited by Andrew Greenland and his colleagues out to North Carolina to present this. And that's fitting because Andy and John Lopresti have made interesting progress on the issue of endogeneity and trade policy. Let's see how they do it and how our approach differs from theirs. So in equation 1, I'm just going to write the ad valorem equivalent of tariffs for a commodity C, that's a product, at initial period T0. And that's just basically a two-parter. That's a tariff for commodity can have two parts in this period. It can either have an ad valorem tariff tau, or it could have a specific tariff, which is F, which is, again, currency units per physical unit, so dollars per bottle of wine. And when you divide that specific tariff by the price or the unit value of that commodity, you get that tariff transforms into an ad valorem equivalent tariff. So again, commodities can have no tariff, they can have an ad valorem tariff, they can have a specific tariff, or they can have both ad valorem and specific, in which case we have a compound tariff. So equation 1 is basically, what is the tariff? And to get that number, you just divide the total amount of import duties collected by the value of imports, or you could take the statutory levels and the unit values to get a ad valorem tariff equivalent for a product. All right, so that's useful. We'll skip, well, number 2 is basically just the share of total revenue on a product collected in terms for a specific tariff. So if F is 0, the share of tariff revenue coming from specific tariffs is 0. If there's no ad valorem tariff on this product and it's all specific, then STS is 1. But in principle, STS can range between 0 and 1. Why do we need that? Well, Greenland-Lopresti showed this nice little, basically took the derivative in equation 3, which no one seems to have done, or at least not used before, but it's very revealing and very important. Equation 3 says that the log change in the measure of tariffs, the ad valorem equivalent, is approximately equal to 3 terms. It's the product of the log change of the unit value of a commodity, the specific tariff share for that commodity, again, between 0 and 1, and that's the lag value, and essentially the tariff markup, or the level of the tariff in the lagged period. If you look at equation 3 long enough, what you may realize is the first 2 terms kind of look like a shift share instrumental variable. And indeed, Greenland-Lopresti note this and show that those first 2 terms, which they call realized protection, RP, is a potentially very good instrument for tariffs. So realized protection is equal to the change in unit values and the lagged level of the specific tariff share revenue. So I'm going to have to motivate why we think this is a good IV, but hang with me for a second just to show you what we did. We're going to, again, pick up with the realized protection variable, and we're going to estimate a regression where we predict the change in a commodity's tariff from 1 year to the next. So T0 is going to be a period like 1870, 1880, 1890. That's a year. That's 10 years before, to go back here. So we're going to have a census period, say, running from 1870 to 1880. So for that period, we'll call it the census period 1880, and we'll use the initial tariff level in 1870. So we'll go back 10 years, essentially, run a regression of the product level change in the tariff between 1869 and 1870 on the realized protection measure and some period dummies. And that gives us what we think is a nice instrumental variable, which is the predicted change in the level of the tariff, which is just basically on the right-hand side, it's the within an industry K, it's just that simple average of the predicted changes in the tariff. So for those who have dozed off to sleep, what we're saying is that for the product level, we can predict your change in tariff with changes in prices or unit values and how much you rely on a specific tariff in that product. And for an industry, we just sum those up across all the products within that industry. And why is this exogenous? Well, if the United States is a small open economy, which you might think at the time is true, it's been so argued by Doug Irwin. And our regressions, I can show you later, where we regress prices on observables, don't seem to be influenced by anything observable. Or you could go with the idea that the specific tariff share is exogenous. Why might that be? Well, here we're going to appeal again to authority. Greenland and Lopresti note that those specific tariff shares were reintroduced with the Morrill tariff in 1860, and that those were basically set prior to the Civil War and not highly influenced by year-to-year changes in lobbying. So a lot of persistence in how reliant a particular product or industry is on specific tariffs. Okay, so recapping, we have a instrumental variable for tariffs. We think it's being driven by exogenous changes in product level unit values or prices, and to a degree on the reliance on specific tariffs in the tariff code. And we think those changes in levels are kind of unrelated to factors driving manufacturing outcomes. So we're going to use this instrumental variable to going back to our estimated equation in two-stage least squares setup. All right, now for the tariff data, I'm going to put on my data hat here and say, well, we care about the data. So what do we got here in terms of the United States and making a contribution to understanding our trade policy? We've for this project, we collected data at the beginning of each census period, so 1870, 80, 90, and 1900. And those are fiscal years if you're really wondering. But it's also related to the census years. We've collected the year just before each of these years posted here. And the tariff data look like this. It was a bear to collect. Some of these products are described in excruciating detail, but once you get it in, it's rich data to be used. And by the way, it shortly will be released by next summer or so. We're going to have a massive online American tariff database for 1789 all the way up to present. I'm working with many collaborators across the country. With our NSF grant, we've been able to compile every tariff line in the history of the nation. So watch out for that. But for this project, it's just selected years. You can see the statutory tariffs. Some are ad valorem tariffs, like the first one, 35% on copper sheets. If you look down further, the cotton textiles have compound tariffs in some cases. We've got the quantities, values, and duties. You put those together with these other years, and you get a picture like this. Tobacco SIC Industry 21 seems to have the highest tariffs in the period at an enormous 100% in 1870. Paper and wood have some of the lowest tariffs. So there's a cross-industry spread in the level of tariffs and some changes over time if you look closely in the ordering of these industries. So tariffs range from 50, 80% all the way down to 15, 20% across industries. We have manufacturing data from the Census of Manufacturers. We're going to be working at the state level here in these census periods, beginning in 1870, 80, 90, 1900, 1909, or call it 1910 if you want to round up. There are many industries in the Census of Manufacturers. We're going to convert them to SIC industries at the 3-digit level. There were about 140 of them before, in the raw data, but after we clean them up and merge them and add them to the tariff data, we have about 80 industries after we clean these industries up. In the census of manufacturing, we have value added, we have workers, we have gross output, number of establishments, and then we can get labor productivity, and we can get gross output divided by establishment, which is a measure of average establishment size, which is a statistic trade economists seem to care about. We're going to deflate these nominal variables with SIC 2-digit deflators. If someone has 3-digit deflators out there in the world, we'd love to hear about it. But for right now, we have 2-digit deflators. Now let's get into the results. You can see the summary statistics here. I draw your attention to the last line, probably the average log change on a 10-year census period basis of tariffs in industry is about 1 log point. Standard deviation is rather larger at about 9 log points, and there's a spread between minus 10 and 9 at the 90-10 deciles. So there's quite a significant amount of overtime and variation and inter-industry variation, as I've mentioned. Let's look at the results now. We're going to show you OLS regressions and then our IV regressions. In the top panel, in panel A here, we have these 6 outcomes as labeled, where our independent variable is the tariff measure, the gross tariff measure, or the nominal tariff measure if you want. And that, again, is lagged 10 years. So we're in column 1, we're looking at labor productivity or value added per worker. And that will be in 1880, 1890, 1900, and 1909. And on the right-hand side, we'll have tariffs lagged 10 years, the level of tariffs lagged 10 years. We'll include period fixed effects and state industry fixed effects. And when you do this regression, you find a negative and significant coefficient on the level of tariffs. It's minus 0.34. So tariffs bring down productivity. It's statistically significant. Now, of course, again, we're going to worry about endogeneity. So look down column 1 to our IV regressions. And here again, we're going to use the instrumental variable as I outlined. In the first stage, the predicted change in tariff, basically is a good predictor of the level of tariffs. And in the second stage, we find a negative and statistically significant association between tariffs and productivity. If you want to size that coefficient, what we find is something like the following. A 10 log point reduction in tariffs would raise productivity by about $700, $800, I think it is. And that basically would be equivalent to moving from the mean to like the 72nd percentile. So a 10 log point change in tariffs is pretty big in our sample. So it's much bigger than a 1 standard deviation change. But the impact isn't small here. And if you're really looking closely, the OLS is much smaller than the IV. Why might that be? Our story that we write down in the paper is that this is consistent with an upward bias of OLS due to lobbying. And the reason is, let's suppose that the true relationship between tariffs and productivity is negative, but that large and productive industries are successful at lobbying and they get tariffs, and they're also more productive. And so if you look at what the bias term for OLS gives you, it basically biases OLS up towards 0, or there's a positive bias. And so when we do IV, we're revealing a stronger negative relationship. So in the remaining 5 minutes, let's go through some kind of other results besides looking at productivity, which, our bottom line is that's a negative relationship, or it's certainly not. There's no evidence of a positive relationship between tariffs and productivity in this period. In terms of other results, looking at the second panel, panel B, here, tariffs reduce average establishment size. They raise gross output and real value added. They raise the number of workers employed in an industry, and they raise the number of establishments. And so that's almost Econ 1. It's consistent with, the first result on average establishment size is consistent with the Melitz model of trade, where higher tariffs allow smaller firms to thrive, and they tend to be less productive. And so we get that kind of entry, and they bring in more workers and more establishments. And so that's all consistent with an Econ 1 kind of interpretation. One auxiliary result we have is that tariffs tend to raise prices as well. So we regress the price deflators and the 2-digit industries on tariffs and the 2-digit industry level. There's a moderate positive relationship there. After that, we looked for heterogeneity in many ways. I'll show you some of the results in my remaining few minutes. There's that old infant industry argument. And while we can't identify infant industries very well ourselves, what we did was select a number of industries as second industrial revolution industries. These are chemicals, electrical, newer products, bicycles, these kind of things. In that subsample, actually, if you look at panel B, tariffs are moderately, well, strongly positively related to productivity, but it's not highly significant. But the effect there is really large. One standard deviation rise in tariffs there is going to give you way more than a one standard deviation rise in productivity. So that's pretty big. On the extensive margin, there's just nothing that's really significant in that subsample. And the IV doesn't work quite as well in that subsample. So we're on borderline weak instrument territory there. Let me show you a few other things. We looked again for heterogeneity, and what we found was something very interesting. The reason we did this, it's kind of a standard check, but I think this is actually substantive, but we're not totally sure why it's happening. But bear with me a second. What we did is just take two-digit industries. So collections of three-digit industries in these two-digit categories. So there are many within each category. And we just ran separate regressions on those subsamples. And for this first table, what we see here is that while the productivity results are kind of mixed, some positive, some negative, some insignificant, across almost all of these industries, the extensive margin has a positive and significant relationship with tariffs. So in these industries, for some reason, tariffs raise employment and output and number of establishments. But that's not true in this other set of industries, where we get the exact opposite, where tariffs are associated strongly with a negative impact on the extensive margin. And this is industries like food and tobacco, paper and publishing, and transportation. In the case of food and tobacco, what we can observe is that those industries are highly concentrated. There's like two major meatpacking companies in the United States. It's highly concentrated in tobacco as well, with American tobacco. And so what we're kind of, thinking here is that in highly concentrated industries, tariffs serve to reduce output, reduce the number of establishments, and lead to further concentration. So that's kind of consistent with this idea from the contemporaries that tariffs led to greater monopoly. Now, it didn't happen across the board because in the previous table, that wasn't evident. And then, there's another mixed bag of industries here, just to be thorough, where the relationship between tariffs and the extensive margin is just not significant. Got about 1 minute left. Let me just leave you with this thought from some case studies which we present in the paper. We went looking for this heterogeneity in the secondary literature, trying to assess whether certain industries were consistent with our regressions. And we found some amusing things. I think for me, one of the most amusing quotes comes from James Foreman Peck, who, in looking at the automobile industry, gives us the following. He says, quote, "U.S. engineers and designers continued to address into the 20th century problems already solved in Europe." And he attributed this backwardness to a lack of integration and competition compared to Europe in the automobile industry and the 45% tariff. So that's consistent. The transportation sector was heterogeneous, but automobiles had yet to have their day. That's going to come later for the US. And at this time, with 40 or 50% tariffs, they're just way behind the Europeans. So hopefully you have benefited from this talk and seen our new data set on tariffs together with the manufacturing data. And the key takeaway, we think, is that there's certainly no positive relationship between tariffs and productivity in this period. Instead, we find a pretty strong negative relationship between tariffs and productivity. Our interpretation is that lower tariffs increase competition, increase innovation, and lead to productivity. And obviously, what we got out of this world in the 19th century in real life was a lot of lobbying and tariffs, where tariffs were going to very successful industries, and they probably didn't need it, but it didn't help them too much necessarily in terms of becoming more productive. Maybe it boosted their revenue, but the social benefits would seemingly be pretty small. So we think it's unlikely that the U.S. Could have become a manufacturing powerhouse due to these tariffs. Seems likely that they overcame the constraint of these tariffs, and the reason would be the economy had lots of other things going for it: agglomeration, the patent system, so intellectual property, natural resources, immigration, and so on. But the tariffs were not the main factor driving this successful drive towards industrialization. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. You gave us quite a bit to think on, and actually I enjoin you to go and read the paper, because there's way more than what Chris was able to summarize in these 40 minutes. And so, so we already have some questions on the queue. They're mostly bordering on clarification. So we have a first question by Eric William, who asks, what data did you use to code lobbying activity? And let me just tag along one of my own on similar nature. Can you tell us a little bit about prices, right? So you said that prices are going to be the shift part of your shift share instrument, but were these actual market prices, or how did the US, how good was the US Customs Office at actually collecting market prices?
Okay, so thanks for those questions. While we don't have any direct data on lobbying, we have an argument that we concocted that would explain the difference between OLS and the IV results. Whether one could do that or not, I don't know. We haven't thought about it in this paper. There's huge literature on this from a qualitative perspective and a quantitative poli-sci literature, but we haven't done any of that in this paper. So that's not in here. And really, in terms of prices, okay, so that's a great question. I'll go back to what the trade data look like, and you can get the value and the quantity for many products in the trade data. So, look at the first line, you got a value of $39 and you got 114 pounds. You divide that up, that's dollars per pound. That's a unit value. Those prices are foreign prices before the tariff hits. They are the prices that were recorded in the bill of lading at departure from the port. So they don't even include transportation costs. Okay. And so those are just, there are a lot of transactions underlying this. So it's probably the average, right? The valuated average of these things, but at the customs houses, all the bills of lading would have been collated, and you get this value. And I didn't have time to show it, but to help you think about whether these things are kind of exogenous, we regressed these 1 year unit value changes on things we could observe, which aren't many, but lagged imports, lagged changes in imports, or the change in imports, and then the specific tariff share and some fixed effects, and they're nothing's very significant there. So I think there's a lot of little shocks here at the product level. They don't seem to be systematically related to these observables, and in this case, in the U.S. case, they seem to be pretty good indicators of the market. Yeah.
Good, thank you. Eric Kittunge asks whether the impact of tariffs was stable over time or whether there's evidence of a learning curve effect in which firms adapt to tariffs over time. So this argument about endogeneity.
Interesting question. Good question. I don't think we've kind of pooled everything together here. I'm trying to think if we did anything like in the cross section or not. I'm not sure we did. And if we did, there was nothing interesting to report there. So I don't know, I think is the short answer to that question. But it's interesting. And sure, there's a lot of heterogeneity here. There's a lot of industries here. There's a lot of sub-industries that we're not able to do justice to. There's a literature on that. We need more of that. And I would, totally encourage that each of these industries deserves their own look. And some are more important than others. But when we add it all up, on average, we're not seeing a big effect. And then I guess my bottom line answer is it's pretty consistent over time in this period. Following on, right, there's a pre-Civil War literature. Paul David contributed to that and others, and looked at learning by doing in the cotton industry and found some evidence of that. And that might be a possibility. That's a different period. After 1900, we don't look at that, and other things could be going on, a lot of other things. So we have one chunk of time here. More work deserves to be done, and I'm confident we can get it done, and other economic historians can. I think it's a crucial issue.
So a classic question. Have you tried your research design on periods of tariff reductions to see whether the effect is symmetrical? This is a question by Paul Zarek.
Yeah. Well, if you look here at the period we're looking at, I mean, 1870, we start with pretty high tariffs, and there's a pretty massive reduction due to statutory changes. Most of that's driven by coffee and tea. Huge shares of imports, and they made those cheaper or free by the 1870s. In the late 70s and 80s is pretty stable, but in the 1890s, we get action, and so that's in there. We get the McKinley tariff, we get a little rise. We get the Gorman-Wilson tariff, Wilson-Gorman tariff of the mid-1890s with a big drop. And then we see a return of protectionism with the Dingley tariff. So you could see some within period changes. But, there are other periods where there's more massive ups and downs, and those would be interesting to study as well. Hasn't been done yet.
Yeah. Guillaume Dodin, I think, if I interpret his question correctly, I think he's also asking the previous question on the evolution of the effect over time, right? But Guillaume, if I'm not interpreting your question correctly, just raise your electronic hand and I'll let you ask it again. Dick Silla. So industrial output grew at an average of 5% in this era. Could your model indicate how fast it would have grown without tariffs? So counterfactual question.
Yeah, well, that gets to our results, which, if we look at, the rightmost columns in panel B here, we're kind of saying that tariffs, yeah, they did boost overall output. They did bring resources apparently into the industrial sector. And without tariffs, things might have grown more slowly. I actually have some results where we actually explicitly look at growth rates. So instead of just looking at levels, we transformed the 10-year changes into growth rates in a period. And so here, Look in panel B again, right? We still see positive coefficients on tariffs, but growth rates would have been considerably smaller if tariffs were lower on the extensive margin. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. And of course, this is just partial equilibrium, diff and diff type stuff where we can only say things in relative terms. But we hope to do something a little bit more structural in the near future and get back to Dick on that question and hope to have an answer. And while we're at it, we'll just plug Yoon's nice study. Again, going back to my literature survey here, Yoon 2020 basically showed that, tariffs had a pretty negligible overall effect on industrial growth in the U.S. economy. And so, we have that result. But we'd like to do more using the disaggregated data and the regional data.
Great. So I think we've exhausted the questions on the queue. So let me abuse of my chair power and ask a different question. So I think I agree that the US was largely a price taker in this period. But I never understood, and I'm sure you guys know the answer to this. I never understood how countries went about choosing whether to impose specific or ad valorem tariffs, right? So, of course, if you go back sufficiently back in time to the 17th century or something, ad valorem tariffs would be complicated to implement. Specific ones would be easier. But if people thought of tariffs in a strategic way, all else equal, I would expect them to use or to avoid specific tariffs for goods on which they had no price control, because then they would be at the complete whim of the market, the world market, right? So what do we know historically, right? When Congress decided, am I going to use a specific or ad valorem tariff? How did they do it?
That's a super important question. Thanks for that. So I liked your last sentence. You said something like, if you didn't have any control over prices, you would avoid specific tariffs. Is that how you said it?
Yep.
Okay. So lots to say here. Lots to say. First, I will say that the obvious thing is when you have a specific tariff, if price goes down, the tariff goes up, and vice versa. And so actually specific tariffs moderate price changes and basically, keep the tariff kind of, they raise the tariff, but they kind of moderate the competitive effects. And so that's kind of a interesting observation on specific tariffs. How do they choose? Well, you're in luck. One of the teams on this NSF grant, Martin Rottenberg and Sharon Triberman and co-authors have a nice paper on this on the political economy of that. It's a great paper. You should check it out. It's a complicated model, but I think their observation is that specific tariffs become increasingly important as state capacity develops. It's actually as you go along and become better administratively, you implement more. And in fact, these things linger. The entirety of the Swiss tariff system is specific tariffs, as I understand it, if not the entirety, a lot. The US still uses them. They're still present. The contemporaries thought it was all about fraud. So if you could under invoice your product on an ad valorem tariff, you could get lower tax. And so what they did was implement specific tariffs where they could to avoid this kind of fraud. And then you just count the items and hit them with the tariff. And so there's a real trade-off, right? You get, ease of collection versus, fraud and administrative capacity. And it's a very interesting question. Also, it turns out Democrats hate specific tariffs. In the 1840s, the Democrats were in charge and they just abolished them. according to Martin Rottenberg's paper. And I can actually see that, and I won't show it to you today, but we have a piece coming out in the Journal of Economic Perspectives where I hope to share that. When the Democrats take over in the 1890s, mid 1890s, and Wilson Gorman, the share of specific tariff lines goes from like 50% down to like 18%. They hate them because they think there's some sort of trickery. They're obfuscation at their finest. So it's really complicated. Seems to have something to do with the product and administrative capacity.
But could it also have to do with the lobbying, right? Going back to lobbying, right? So yeah, I understand. Specific tariffs are a way of protecting the level of protection. Sorry for the repetition. If overall world prices are coming down, right? So it could be that more influential sectors or industries lobbied to have those, and if the Republicans, all else equal, were in favor of protectionism, then you would have the explanation for the change with the Democrats. But anyway, Nathan Sussman has his electronic hand raised. So Nathan.
Oh, hi. Well, Chris, thank you for the presentation. It was great. I mean, I know it's a kind of something outside the paper, but I think it's probably important. I mean, I find it important is what happens to capital accumulation. So in your regressions, you show establishment, you show labor, you show all kinds of things, but not capital. So it could have been kind of one channel through which this could have worked. I don't know. I have no idea. I'm not a US economic historian, but that's just thinking about tariffs. And the other one is, again, this relates to research on the 20th century, is TFP growth rather than labor productivity growth. So if it kind of increases innovation or all kinds of other things are not measured immediately through labor productivity, although there is a relationship between them, but we know it's not necessarily one-to-one or contemporaneously one-to-one. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Alex might have something to contribute here, so feel free to chime in, Alex. But yeah, I think the capital measures in the census aren't ideal by any means. And TFP, to calculate that, you need to believe in the capital, which is tricky. We hear you, but we tried to avoid that. Alex, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so a lot of work has been done on the capital stock in the 19th century United States at the US aggregate level. But when you go to the state industry level, there are some oddities we could not ignore. For example, if you calculate TFP in the post-Bloom era, that some years where, for instance, industries in Alabama have higher TFP than industries in New York, which goes against all the qualitative information that we have. Only one person I'm aware of who really tried to tackle it was Richard Easterlin in late 1950s, where he recalculated capital stock estimates at the state level, and in a sense that capital stock now makes sense in terms of it matches with the qualitative information, but not at a state industry level. So there is a research to be done on, really looking at the state industry or even city industry, county industry level capital stock data as reported by sensible manufacturers, and compare them in the regional perspective to make sense of them. Because of these issues, we decided that's a separate paper to address that. But as Chris said, this is an important thing, looking at TFP and the capital stock accumulation at state industry level.
Yeah, it's definitely something to look forward to. So you have your hands full if you go for it, but it would be really interesting to complement it, I think, with that perspective. Yeah.
So we are at the end of our hour. People who follow these webinars, this is not the end of the webinar. It's just a moment to let hurried people go on with their lives. So let us thank our two presenters, Chris and Alex, who just showed up, for bringing this super interesting research. And especially, we look forward to all the follow-up papers from that mega database. We look forward to the database as well, as with economic historians. But let's just thank them again. So this ends the formal part of the webinar. And the last thing I want to say, two last things. So the first one is to wish everyone very happy holidays and a great entry in 2026. And remind everyone that we carry on in 2026 and the new series will start on February 11th. And we can already announce that the first presenter will be George Selgin, who will be talking about his new book, False Dawn, The New Deal and the Promise of Recovery. So we look forward to see you all then and there. And now we continue. So, something else I wanted to ask. So other than the selection of different types of tariffs, you mentioned at the very end of your presentation, Chris, that there's many other things that were moving U.S. industry, specialization, productivity, and so on, like availability of specific natural resources, market power, and so on. And two things that were on my mind were precisely local market power. Okay, fine. The U.S. is price taker worldwide, but there was, this is also the period. It's called the Gilded Age for a reason, right? So I wonder whether your heterogeneity, right, in results is not a reflection of local market power or national market power, and whether you can measure that. So you can start with that, and then the other question is, so I know that there's no input-output matrix for this period, as far as I know, right? But some of these industries would be more dependent on, they would be more upstream, right? So they would depend more, and others would be more exported. So is there some variation on this? Could this again explain or help explain the puzzling heterogeneity, right? Because you have, primary sectors that have a positive effect and primary sectors that have a negative effect. So
yeah.
Back to you.
If I may, Chris, before you give the full answer, there is input-output table for the US economy for 1899.
Fantastic.
By Mr. Whitney, his PhD dissertation from Harvard from 1968, I believe. It's at more or less SRC two-digit level, maybe a couple of industries missing, and we use that in the paper. But there is certainly, there is a scope to recreate or reconstruct input-output table afresh.
Right, but not at your three-digit level. Yes.
Yeah. Actually, if you get the manuscripts or the samples, you can do something, perhaps in some rudimentary way. Talking with Martin Rottenberg the other day, and they seem to be working on it, and that would be a great contribution. And we hope that we can either replicate that or he'll share it. We did do something using an input-output table from a little bit later in the 20th century based off Leontiev in the paper, right? And you may have seen, but input tariffs. Okay, so that input-output table is not ideal. It's a bit aggregated. It's kind of more at the two-digit level.
Mm-hmm.
But we can kind of measure these input tariffs, and they're pretty highly correlated with what you call the output tariffs or the nominal tariffs. But when we put both in at the same time, we get kind of consistent effects. Both bring down productivity, but the input tariffs aren't highly significant. So we're working on that. We're thinking about it and how to better incorporate it. It's an important thing. On concentration, as far as we're aware, there's no great measure at the industry level, right, of concentration. There's a couple of recent dissertations that have tried to do this a little bit more systematically than had been done before, and we need to look into that a little bit and see if we can get some measures of that we could use as a control. That would be fantastic if we can. But we didn't have anything systematic at this point.
So you wouldn't have. I'm asking out of ignorance, right? So the census didn't report aggregate profits, or by sector, you don't have anything like that.
Go ahead, Alex.
Census. Well, we can calculate value added for industries at state and for some years at city level. So yes, it's there, but profit as such, not really. So what you have in the sense of the information which goes into production function. So you have employment, you have gross output,
Right.
you have various elements of inputs. They vary across censuses, but they can be nicely consistent over time. You have capital stock. We discussed it earlier. So you can calculate real value added measure that we use, and real value added per worker. That's what census will give you.
Would you have ROA? I mean, just if we don't have profits, but you have the value of the sales, right? Or net income or something, or but again, we go back to the asset story, which is the
yeah. Very hard to measure. Yeah. How about comparative advantage? So how do these level of protection, since you have all this beautiful disaggregated data, right? How does it compare with revealed comparative advantage?
Well, roughly speaking, yeah, tariffs are lower in commodities and raw materials, where the U.S. just totally dominates. You know, so yeah, there is that heterogeneity. Nothing systematic we've been able to do in this paper, and to get revealed comparative advantage, you kind of have to have the world trade matrix. So I don't know, but you can eyeball it and see it. So there's that. Tobacco. America probably has a supreme Ricardian comparative advantage in making cigarettes by the late 19th century, and for some reason, tobacco industry succeeds in getting 100% tariffs on the output.
Precisely. So, yeah. That's precisely why I asked this question, right? I said, well,
could be a little bit about the nature of the product. It's inelastically demanded, and they knew that, or could just be lobbying. Hard to say. I looked a little bit for business histories of American tobacco, didn't find much, and maybe need to do a little more digging on that, but it's interesting question.
That's the thing. Yeah, you get better data, you have twice the questions you started with. So well done.
For sure.
Yeah. So I think we're reaching our level of questions for today. I think we're done.
Yep.
So, okay. So thanks again in a more informal way. Thanks, guys, for bringing your super interesting
Thank you.
And again, happy holidays to everyone who's still around. Looking forward to seeing you in person or online in 2026. So have a great one.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. And we appreciate all the comments from everyone. And happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.